Lead balloons.
Lead balloons.
The alchemy of unpopular opinions.
Unpopular opinions.
Yeah, I feel a little spicy today, so all bets are off.
And I know that you're out to get the ladies.
We're not encouraged to think critically.
Life is hard. It's supposed to be hard.
Oh my god. That's hilarious. Busted.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Lead Balloons. Trent, Jordan Peterson sucks. Jordan Peterson is awesome. Discuss.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, coming right out of the gate. I love it. I love it. Well, Joel, I don't have any strong feelings about this. I feel pretty tepid about it.
Whatever.
No, what I really think. So Jordan Peterson, let me just say, because we're going to talk about his ideas. Jordan Peterson is not my kind of man. He's not my kind of person. One of the reasons is I don't see him smile a lot, and he doesn't make me laugh a lot. And even if we're talking about very serious things, I want to laugh, I want to smile. It's the same reason, like a guy like Sam Harris, who's this well-known atheist. Sam Harris and I agree on a lot more things, I think, than I agree with Jordan Peterson on. But Sam also is somebody, they're both very earnest and very serious.
Very
and I
serious.
get the sense that sort of like the universe is riding on their shoulders. And that doesn't work for me. One of my, Jordan is kind of seen as like a public intellectual of the day. And one of my favorite public intellectuals was Christopher Hitchens, who died, I think, in 2011. And Hitchens was a guy who was very serious about a lot of things, but was constantly peppering his lectures and debates with irony. He would talk about the gin and the Campari, the cream and the coffee. People would ask him questions about, what do you think is the meaning of life? And he would give irreverent answers. So he was a guy who's just always keeping you laughing, even while he's making really serious points. And he, to me, is, when I contrast Jordan Peterson to Hitchens, he just doesn't measure up. And that being said, Jordan Peterson doesn't always rub me the wrong way, or doesn't always rub me the right way. But I did watch a recent interview that he did with Piers Morgan. I have to say, I started the interview a little upset with Jordan Peterson, and then I watched the whole interview, and I did warm to him a little bit. So I felt a little bit. We'll talk about this. I feel like he's got a lot of great ideas, but there's some areas where I think he's way off. So we'll talk about it. But
there's some flies in the ointment.
That's right.
Absolutely. Yeah, Mr. Peterson. I would like to know what, who does rub you the right way. So that would be another podcast maybe. But yeah, absolutely. I hear you kind of talking about him not smiling and not like peppering things with more humor. And dude, the guy has a helium voice, in my opinion. His wavy hair and helium voice. He talks an octave, at least half an octave higher than most people. Yet he is attracting this huge base of young men who resonate a lot with what he's talking about. So we'll get into that. Hey, welcome everyone to our podcast, Lead Balloons, the alchemy of unpopular opinions. Today we're talking about this man, Jordan Peterson. But before that, we're gonna zoom out, and I just want to kind of talk about personality-driven brands. There's this kind of world of personality brands that they're YouTubers, they're podcasters, they're writing books, and they're speaking in conferences, and they're just everywhere. And there's this very particular, I can smell the marketing dripping off of them, these brands of these individuals. And it reminds me of sort of the advent of the mega church, when we got these pastors who were very personality driven. These churches were very tied to the personality of their pastor. I think of when I was in seminary, the two biggest pastors, both of them were pastors at churches named Mars Hill, and they couldn't have been more opposite in terms of their evangelical theology. One was Mark Driscoll, and one was Rob Bell. And they were so well known. Both are, I don't know where Mark Driscoll is. He's probably pastoring a small church somewhere in Phoenix, something like that. And Rob Bell is out surfing and having like people come to him to hear him talk about things. Anyways, what is your kind of like, have you seen this kind of show up in our culture in terms of these personality brands? What is this trend, Trent?
I think I've seen it for sure. I think I've definitely seen it. I think those are good references that you make. But it's definitely a thing. Other names that would come to my mind would be like John MacArthur, John MacArthur, who's a conservative preacher out of Southern California, Ben Shapiro, conservative commentator, Sam Harris is an atheist, but he's got a big podcast and something big following. These are people who, I mean, a lot of them have great ideas, but I think what ends up happening is they become so influential and they become so well known and popular that in some ways they become hyper aware of their own personality and expectation of their audience, and they become almost beholden to that. Mm-hmm. And I think it can become an obstacle to people thinking new thoughts. I've been around churches and in office settings and stuff, and you've been, in a lot of different corporate world and the church settings as well. And we've seen how people really like the person who can give the definitive answer to the hard questions of life, who can speak, like you've said before, in declarative statements. There's a part of us, and I'm someone who likes that as well. I'm not exempt from that, but it's nice to have people who tell you this is what's true about this, not I wonder about this, or this might possibly be true. We like the people who can give definitive answers. And I think brands grow up a lot of times around people who can say, I know what you should think about these things. Because we've got so much complexity in our world, so many mixed messages and a lot of sources of confusion. It's nice to have that clear voice.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me, that people are attracted to that. I saw that happen in the religious world. We see that happen in the political world. Definitely we see this happen in popular culture as well. So this guy, Jordan Peterson, I'm not going to act like I'm an expert on him. I did pick up his book years ago, 12 Rules of Life. I think I got halfway through it. Like a lot of books that I read, I at some point I'm just like, I need to read something new. I'm tired of this. But I remember enjoying it. I was just peeking through it. I underlined quite a lot. I write little stars by the things that I want to go back to. And he kind of reminds me a little bit of my attraction to philosopher William James in terms of just taking responsibility for your own life. He clearly has grown in like huge popularity in the past couple of years. They like made a documentary about him, like The Rise of Jordan Peterson or something like that. I don't remember. I don't follow all of it. Some people are huge fans of his and can tell us all that. Why don't you give us a primer of your understanding on this guy? What do you know about him, and what is he considered a subject matter expert on?
Sure. So I'll just refer to some of my notes. You see me looking away here, but just some bio data bullet points here. Uh-huh. So he's he's trained as a clinical and research psychologist. Yeah. I believe he was at McGill University and then a couple other places where he did his training. And so he's a trained clinical research and psychologist. And he taught at Harvard. So he has a very rich pedigree, both of his educational background and then in his work. I mean, he's a legit psychologist who's done research, who's done hundreds, if not thousands of hours of clinical work. He has a ton of experience on that. He's an author. He's a speaker. He is a podcaster now, I believe. He's a husband, a father. So he has worn and is wearing a lot of hats. He's Canadian. As far as where he is a subject matter expert, I mean, I think clearly he is on psychology. And so then within that realm or under that rubric, he would, I think, also be an expert on like relationships and marriage counseling and marriage coaching, couples coaching, these kinds of things. He knows that quite well. I think he's quite well versed on politics. He speaks on economics. He speaks on religion. And I mean, he speaks on most cultural topics that are of interest to the larger, the broader public. He's pretty willing to speak on just about anything. I would not call him a subject matter expert on economics or religion, perhaps politics, but certainly he's a very well-read person, and he knows his stuff for sure. But I don't think that in my version of things, he doesn't quite rise to the level of a public intellectual, because I don't think he has a good enough grasp on enough topics that are of interest in the culture to be considered that.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I read most of the 12 Rules of Life, and I remember being impressed with his ability to synthesize things, and
yeah,
like his philosophical views I found interesting. I think when I read it years ago, I was more attracted to it than, going back and kind of looking at it and going, yeah, I can see some kind of weird ways he's looking at things that are very like, I kind of get Ayn Rand kinds of vibes from him, just uber individualistic, which is not wrong, but if you only look at that, it creates blind spots. And I did like, he kind of like, he uses his imagination to think about Christianity and Taoism, or like I heard him talk about the golden snitch in Harry Potter as a way to like think about like moral compass and things of that nature. And I like it when intellectuals will synthesize information and they will kind of use their imagination to think of things mythologically. It's almost like Jordan Peterson has this kind of Joseph Campbell vibe of mythology, and I kind of like that, and I think that's where his psychology experience comes into play. However, I get very uncomfortable when I look at his audience. Who are the people that are attracted to him? And I wonder why they're primarily so homogenous in terms of young white men. And that, to me, if someone's speaking like truth that resonates universally, why is it not resonating with others? And that is, I don't know, that to me is a kind of going like, something's going on here. And I don't know, I want to have this conversation with you to help unpack that. So
sure.
Let's talk about this idea that powerful perspectives can have blind spots.
Mm-hmm.
Just speak to that to me. Like, what does that statement mean to you?
Powerful perspectives can have blind spots. There's only so much that you can know and that you can know well. And we both know, let's say in our study of biblical literature, the deeper in you get and the more you, quote, know, the more, and this is the Socratic thing, the more that you know, the more that you realize you don't know. And in some ways, you lose your capacity to be dogmatic on those issues, even as your knowledge grows. And so, and when you become super passionate about certain issues, it's difficult to backpedal and step away for a while and see the areas, especially when you have so many people who are depending upon you. Yep. You become kind of like a pope in the sense people are expecting you to have the answers for them. And and so when that's the case, you're going to miss things, and you're not going to be maybe as willing, I think, to say, well, here's what I think, but I could be wrong on this. And you see with like Jordan Peterson, there's this capacity to be like, have this, again, earnestness and intense conviction about a lot of things that a lot of people would just say, well, here's what I think on this. But I'm not too sure, and here's how I might be wrong. So yeah. What about yourself?
I picked that up too with him. There is I smell a little bit of believing his own press for a bit here, and there's a little bit of kind of the anointing that I see that he's enjoying experiencing. Now, I've heard him before talk about a lot of his physical ailments, and he's quite honest about that, and it's actually quite beautiful the way he talks about some of those things. But the way that he answers some of the questions, it does feel very like ex cathedra. The Pope, speaking the word of God, sort of way, and then we'll get into this where he chooses not to give straight answers. He's very much like, I just need to think on that for like 3 years, and I'll give you the answer. And it's just kind of like, who says that?
Yeah.
So let me give an example. I heard him on a podcast, and one of the guys, whoever the host was, is asking him about conspiracy theories. And he gave a big, long rebuttal to these things existing. I think, and I tend to be that way as well. I tend to dismiss conspiracy theories, and he gave an answer that I thought was legitimate. He was saying that he worked with like the UN and he was writing papers for some bureaucratic process, and what his experience was is how long it took for things to get up to the top and get approved, and that no one had their shit together. And it's like, how could an organization like that, that's so unorganized, pull together a conspiracy and keep it hidden from anyone? And I thought that was a good point. But the problem is that actually conspiracy theorists don't think that. They don't think that the whole government is doing it. They usually think that there's small groups of people that are spearheading very nefarious sorts of agendas. And he doesn't speak to that. And what ends up happening, if you're not someone who's a critical thinker and really paying attention, you'll hear Jordan Peterson's dismissal of it, and you think, yeah, they're wrong. But he didn't cover all the bases. He just covered part of it.
Well, I think that's one of my things is, again, I have a hard time relating to him because I don't operate that way. He has a quite a knack for just dismissing things out of hand, particularly things that could be potential and could be quite interesting. He said, "Oh, no, this is the case. That couldn't be the case. How could this be the case? It certainly isn't." And instead of being a little bit more nuanced and saying, "Well, let's talk about a conspiracy simply when you have more than one person, a group of people getting together to plan something that's often sort of behind the scenes and usually with the sense of there's, like you said, a nefarious purpose." He does, in my view, he tends to speak dismissively of things when it's like, wait a second, man, like there's other ways to look at this, and let's maybe try to acknowledge that. But it kind of helps his brand because he's the guy that talks tough, and he's the guy that says, no, there's nothing to that. This is what you should think. It's like, no, that's not how most things are. Most things are very complicated. In fact, I'm sure we'll get to in a second, he's quite ready to tell us when certain questions are extraordinarily complicated, so complicated that you could barely speak of them until you've done 3 years of research. And then other really complicated things, he gives a one sentence answer to, and we move on.
Yep.
I don't know how you do that. I have a hard time relating to that myself.
Yeah, I agree. There is a little bit of almost honestly, I don't know if it's a blind spot or if it's done intentionally, but it feels like if you're not someone who is in any of these realms, you would just take him at his word. Why would you question him? He feels so confident. He clearly has intellectual chops. He clearly has the pedigree. Why question him? And I've seen that happen in so many circles, and it always just is a little disturbing when I see audiences who are attracted to an individual and have that kind of relationship, just this almost uncritical trust of a public figure who's clearly incentivized by an audience listening to them uncritically. What I want to do is talk about a couple. We'll talk about a couple small issues that he's spoken up about, and then we'll get into the big one on kind of religion. So one of the ones that I heard you brought to my attention, this little clip where he does this rant on why people who don't want to have children, what do you call them, immature? Tell me about this.
He basically says, I'm going to do a rough paraphrase. He
Talk
says,
a little bit higher when you do it.
Yeah. No, I have not mastered the Jordan Peterson accent. Well, you may want to get married to a person. You may want to get married and weave your life together with somebody, and then you may want to have kids. And if you don't want to have kids, then you're either deluded or immature. For all our ancestors for 1 billion years, everyone has been reproducing. So good luck with not being a part of that. So to call people who don't want to have kids deluded or immature, I mean, what kind of blanket sweep is that?
Ridiculous.
I don't understand it, because I'm sure that if he stepped back for a moment, he himself would realize that there are good non-diluted, mature reasons for not having kids. Now, those could be selfish reasons or whatever, but he himself, I'm sure, would agree. There's some people who do not need to be having kids ever. And there's other people who could but choose not to for whatever reason. And to just immediately call those kinds of people deluded or immature seems very strident and very
it's like it makes me question his ability. Makes him question his ability to think about what he's saying. Like, there's so many things he's saying. I'm going like, yeah, I jive with that. Yeah, I jive with that. Wait, what?
To be deluded or immature. And by the way, here's another thing. Being a mature human being, it's not like a huge goal. It's again shows how it's like the morality police. Just don't you want to be mature? Not really. I want to be someone that people are. I mean, I want to be someone who's reliable and interesting and a great friend, all these kinds of things. But like, oh, I'm mature now. Previously, I was immature. I don't care. I don't care if somebody. I don't have kids. And there's been a variety of reasons for that.
Sure.
And so, whatever. I'm sure I've missed out on things, and I'm sure people with kids have missed out on things that I've gotten to do. I don't call them immature for having kids or myself mature for not having. It's just crazy. And then, especially in the context of him being just so willing to be befuddled by certain other questions, and then a question like this, where there is a potential for a lot of nuance, he's not nuanced at all. I mean, that is an instant buzzkill.
Yeah, as soon as he's like. So many like points of evolution for the justification of this. I'm like, okay, the world we're living in is so extraordinarily different than just 100 years ago, let alone 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 years ago. These are such different scenarios to say that's how we have to be wired. And it's just like, yeah, like you haven't killed a person. You know what? We've been killing each other for a very long time. So you must just be a pussy. You know, it's like,
right.
I don't wanna, it's such a stupid argument. Like there's so much intellect, and just like folly. What is that? What is happening? So another one he goes off on that. This is another example where I actually largely agree with, and this is definitely going to be a little lead balloony, but where he talks about white privilege. And there's been several things, and there's sound bites. I don't have access to maybe the whole context of the conversation, so I want to be fair and say that. But the ones that get reposted are little sound bites where he says white privilege is just, basically he dismisses it and talks about how you can't hold individuals, you can't condemn them with collective guilt. Now, I personally agree with that. I agree that there are ways that, and we talked about this with devilish advocates, bad ways of doing good, where you can't be right by making other people wrong. And he does speak eloquently in some ways that I find that I actually agree with. But then what ends up happening is people then dismiss the whole idea of white privilege. They just dismiss it out of hand. And I'm like, whoa, wait. While I may disagree with what is done with these truths, I absolutely agree that it's a thing. White privilege is a thing, and me becoming aware of it then invites me into a thing he talks all the time about, which is personal responsibility. How can I then be a part of a world where I know this is a thing, but how can I make this less suffering for those around me who don't get this thing? I didn't earn it. I think he said, like, when privilege is real, but you just have to live like you deserve it, hope to live up to deserving. I'm like, deserving it? No one fucking deserves it. No one chooses where they're born. Like, what are these words? I don't understand.
I know. Yeah. And I think just on that human level, listen, I do believe he's a sincere person, and I believe that he's a compassionate person. I think he cares enormously for people and for the culture. I know that he does. But I think the right response, like we both have friends who are different than us ethnically and ancestrally and culturally. And when those friends tell me about their lived experience of walking in a neighborhood at a certain time of day, their interactions with maybe law enforcement or in an academic environment or in a work environment, I'm not going to assume that what they're saying is infallible that they know exactly why what's happening to them is happening to them. But it's important to hear people and take seriously what they're saying and know that that experience is not the experience that I've had. So I want to get into that. Then we can step back and look at numbers and data and these kinds of things. But the lived experience of people who are vulnerable enough to tell you their story, you don't just dismiss those things, I don't think. I mean, maybe some of the work goes into coming up with maybe better terminology perhaps than white privilege, because I was watching that video and he makes a good point about intersectionality, and there's sort of that tension between intersectionality, because once you go down that road and start talking about how, well, if you're black, well, what if you're a black woman? He says, what if you're a gay black woman who's poor, whatever. I mean, so all these things pile on, and they just basically enhance the sense of the uniqueness of your story. And of course, then that means that everybody is unique. Every white person is unique, and there's not one story. Yet we know that there are groups of people who have clusters of stories that fit together enough so that we can speak of them as groups. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think when I hear him speak, he does call out some of the ills that I agree with. What he does not allow for is some of the valid arguments that still, I would argue, need to be considered, and what could invite us into a life of helping and serving. And it sounds like he wants to encourage that, yet for reasons I don't understand, doesn't. And so you'll find people who have the same philosophical bent do that. I saw someone repost one of his videos on white privilege, and it was a black man who used to be a police officer, and he talks about, like, if I was a business owner, I've never walked around being black and people looked at me differently. And I'm like, well, that's great, good for you. I've heard very, very different stories from a lot of other African Americans.
Sure.
But he said, but if I was a store owner and you were walking in, it wouldn't matter if you're black or white, but if your pants were hanging low, I would be worried that you'd steal something. And I'm like, wow. So, like, you were going from this intellectual talking about the philosophy of intersectionality to now people taking these ideas to justify judging people by their clothes. Like, sometimes that's true. Sure, stereotypes are sometimes true, but is that really what we're promoting here? Is developing a world based upon, like, very, like, veneer kinds of judgments? And I get worried when I see the product of a belief or a doctrine or something of that sort. I begin to, like, look at how are people taking this and using it. So we'll get to that later. But I'm just curious here. I want to launch you into what might be, we'll take the lion's share here to talk about this strange hesitancy he has around Christianity or theology, spirituality in general. He talks a lot in terms of referencing and bringing up stories from history. But, in that what was the Piers Morgan quote or Piers Morgan interview? Tell me a little bit about the hesitancy that you saw there and you continue to see in other interviews.
So there's multiple instances, multiple interviews and settings where he's been asked point blank if he believes in God. And if there are other Christian doctrines, whether or not he believes in those. But in this interview that I think came out not too long ago with him and Piers Morgan, I think it's their second interview, Piers Morgan said, "Do you believe in God?" He said to Jordan, "What I love about having you on is you're authentic. You're a truth teller. And I know that when I ask you a question, you give me the truth, but the one question that you're evasive on is a question about your belief in God." And he says, "Do you believe in God?" And I'm going to refer back to my notes here. Jordan says basically, I don't think that's anybody's business. It's a private, and then I'm kind of paraphrasing. It's a private question. It's the most private thing. And then then Piers Morgan says, "Well, do you think there's a God?" And then Jordan says, "I'm terrified there might be." And then another thing he says about the question, "Do you believe in God?" It's not a well-posed question. Now, there's several things there that we can unpack, and we can go back and forth on this because I don't want to speak too long on a monologue. But when you are sort of a quote unquote public intellectual and people look to you for answers and you give them clear answers to very difficult questions, we have kind of a right to know whether or not you believe in God. It's really not that difficult of a question. And by the way, even if you're not certain, if somebody says, do you believe in God? There's a variety of ways you can answer. You could say, yes, I do. You could say, tell me who you mean by God. Or you could say, no, I don't believe in any of the gods that have been proposed to me. And then add a couple sentences for nuance. Your audience is going to be sophisticated enough to be, hopefully, 9 out of 10 people are going to be compassionate enough to be able to say, I bet that answer doesn't contain everything that he might think about religion. But to be that evasive and elusive is very suggestive of something else pernicious going on, and I don't like it at all.
Yeah, I mean, what if you lose one of those 10 people? That's a lot of money.
It's money lost. He is a multimillionaire. It's money lost for sure. I don't know. That's a possibility. Is that he knows who his base is, and
I clearly don't know. Yeah.
I mean, I don't. But here's the thing. A lot of people who follow him are evangelicals.
Yeah.
And to just come right out and say I do not believe in God is a non-starter. You're going to lose people for sure. The other thing that I think's going on, Joel, is when he says he reveals much more than he might realize. When Piers Morgan says, "Do you think there's a God?" and he says, "I'm terrified there might be," I might add that he also might say, "I'm terrified there might not be." Because what I think is going on in Jordan Peterson's head is, and I have evidence to support this too from watching videos, Jordan is sympathetic to people who are very aware of the dangers of religious fundamentalism. He's also terrified of a world in which religion doesn't exist anymore. I think he's scared of that world. And maybe there are good reasons for that. But I think he's not only scared of the God who judges, but also scared of a world in which there's no religion. And so he's terrified either way about these things. But to say I'm terrified there might be. My goodness, Joel, I mean, what do you think about a person whose main answer to a question about do you think there's a God is to express terror? What is that? I'm personally on the spot here.
I mean, I've met people who have had that answer, but they tend to not be like strong critical thinkers, or they tend to not be people who know how to navigate the realms of academia and intellectualism. There are people that have these kind of view of the Zeus in the sky kind of terror. People like Jordan Peterson, I don't put in that category, and I have a hard time understanding what he means by terror, other than maybe he's afraid of what that might mean for his personal responsibility. That's the only thing I can think of, having read some of his books there. And the answer to that question to me is I'm like you, dumbfounded. What is happening there? You know who he reminds me of when it comes to that is Rob Bell. When Rob Bell was on the precipice of his great fall, he wrote this book that was a New York Times selling book, Love Wins. And there were a lot of people in the media who were pushing him to like declare, do you believe, are you a universalist, or do you believe in hell? And even Jordan Peterson touches on that when Piers Morgan asked, do you believe in hell? And he says, well, all you have to do is read history, and you look at these situations, that's hell. And that Rob Bell made that same argument in Love Wins. He's like, love or hell is everywhere. Hell is all around us. And then Piers Morgan asks Jordan Peterson, do you believe in heaven? He says, it's kind of like, I don't know. It's just like, wait a second. You're so free to answer these questions, but not free to answer these. And it makes no sense. And what I remember about Rob Bell was I wanted to just like come up to him and say, hey, buddy, just tell him what you actually believe. It's okay. Yes.
Yes,
you're
it's
gonna
going to.
lose book sales no matter what you say here. I
That's
get
right.
it.
Yeah.
You want to keep kicking the can down the road. You don't want to have
Yeah.
to do this. You don't want to create division. You don't want to create. I get it. I understand.
Yeah.
But just tell them. Tell us what you believe. And that's where I feel like with Jordan Peterson, it's like, hey buddy, I know you believe something about this. Even if it's like you're holding it loosely and you want to research it more, like keeping this like thick veil over all of these things is really weird when your brand is the answer man. A brand that
That's
you
right.
developed, your marketing team is clearly
That's right.
developing, and just like I'd stop feeling it starts smelling off. Like, when you smell the milk and you're like, something's wrong there. That's that's the wafts I'm getting.
That's right. Is this meat a week old? Do
Yes.
we dare cook it up? When Piers Morgan asked him if he prays, he said, "Oh, all the time." And he said, Piers said, "Who do you pray to?" And he said, "To the spirit that protects me from hell." What in God's holy name could that possibly mean? Now, if I say, Joel, today's been a hell of a day, I had a rough day.
Sure.
If I say God only knows, what I'm really saying is I don't know.
Sure.
There's nobody who knows. We all know that you can use hell as a metaphor for like the worst possible situation that's happening. The people in the Middle East are going through hell right now. We understand what we're saying. But here's what I don't like. I think that telling people, and in particular children, that there is a place called hell that they could go to and be tortured eternally in fire if they don't repent of their sins and believe in Jesus Christ is one of the worst things that you can do. And to hold it out, to pragmatically, if that's what Jordan's doing, to use the concept of hell pragmatically to keep people in terror about moral bad behavior and sin, so that it's sort of this just tool for sanctification, I think is wrong. I think it's manipulative, and I believe that it's ugly. And I don't think that you ought to do that. Just say, like, again, be truthful and say, I don't think there's any evidence for a real place called hell. But I think it's good to think about the hells that we create by our collective and individual bad behavior. What would be wrong with that? By the way, when somebody asks you, do you think there's a resurrection? Jordan, most people aren't thinking about the phenomenological and literary and psychological truth of the resurrection. What they want to know is, do you think a guy died and came back to life called Jesus? Now, just say, I don't think that probably happened, or I think that probably happened. It's fine. And then say, I'd like to learn more about it. I want to learn more about it. It's possible he did. I don't know. But I can still say I know the significance of it. And why it's been a powerful thing, but I don't know if it happened. I'm inclined to doubt it. And he just can't bring himself to say these things. And it's really, really harmful, because you're telling people basically have two brains. One brain is the brain that says, I'm rational and I can think through these things and make really good decisions. And the other is, I can convince myself that this stuff that I know isn't true, like hell and the resurrection, I'm going to, like he says, live like it's true. So you get this constant self-deception where you don't really think it's true, but you wake up each morning and you pray to the spirit that protects you from hell, and you go through that exercise, and you're this split personality. How can you have peace that way? It just absolutely grinds my gears.
I hear it, man. I love it. I love it. Yeah, when I hear that, I struggle with it. Like, listen, I've been in these situations where I was trying to hold a community together when I was a pastor, and people would ask me questions, and for a long time it's, where do you stand on LGBTQ? I would get those emails, and I kept kicking that can down the road. I kept kicking it down the road because, honestly, there were still, like, I had my own kind of views, but not everyone on our staff had the same views. Certainly I knew that this could be difficult for our community. And so I just kind of kept a lot of those in, and I developed some answers that were basically non-answers. But the truth was, I had an authentic answer. and I was scared to give it. And that's what was happening. And eventually
Yeah. Yeah.
that happened. And I gave an answer, and we transitioned a community that was conservative into, fully inclusive of our LGBTQ members. Now, and that had some very unwelcome consequences. People that I thought were friends all of a sudden saw me as a heretic and left, and that relationship was immediately severed. It also has some good consequences. We're invited some people into feeling like, okay, here's this person that represents this religion that I've often felt shame from, now speaking life and love over me. And I wonder if there's an opportunity. Like, I would just want to have like a conversation with Jordan Peterson and say, hey man, I really like the way you think. And I think that a lot of these topics that you just courageously dive into,
Yes.
you dive into these so courageously, and you don't care about the consequences. You've made so many enemies in the socio-political world. I mean, the enemies he made in Canada when he spoke up against some of the gender stuff, I was just like, oh my gosh, this guy has got like some cojones.
Ballsy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then here he is, and you're like, well, do you believe in God? And it's just like, tiptoe through the tulips, I'm just like, what are you doing, man? I don't, like, if you have a practice that's really helping you, that may help some other people. And I can't think of a good reason for him to not say that if he has also built an entire like brand off of saying whatever he thinks. And to me, that's where I think that your questions about this, it's kind of like, okay, this just feels like a business decision.
And what's ironic is he wasn't. I don't think that Jordan. Well, clearly, when he came out with his thoughts on the gender questions in Canada. This was like 2016 or 20. I think it was 2017. He wasn't a big thing. Now, he'd written a book or two, and he had some video stuff, and he was reasonably well known, I think, in his own way in Canada. But he spoke courageously when it could have cost him a lot. Mm-hmm. Now he's this multimillionaire doing quite well with tremendous influence. He's got fuck you money. Mm-hmm. He's got not Joe Rogan type money, but he's got enough of that fuck you money. And that's why it's so weird. Like, he was on the Piers Morgan interview. He said, I would just tell people, if you want to have the greatest adventure in life, tell the truth, because you don't know what's going to happen. If you don't speak up, you already know what's going to happen. If you tell the truth, you don't know. It's a great adventure. And like he said, it will justify the misery of your existence, waiting to see what will happen when you do that. I would just say, Jordan, like you said, man, you got some really good things to say on relationships, and your observations on psychology and literature and these kind of really good. You've got a real good pulse on the things that are. He's a great diagnostician. But what I would say is, man, you've just said telling the truth is the way to go, and it's have a great adventure with what you really think about religion, and just see what happens. Mm-hmm. You might grow in ways you couldn't expect, but you might also lose some people that only liked you because you said the things that they wanted to hear. I think he's going against his own personal motto when he does that. And so not only that irritates him, and that irritates me a little bit, but it irritates me, and I think there's a lot of people who don't need to be under the impression, particularly sensitive souls, and I was one of them, and I probably still am, don't need to be under the impression that there's a hell you can go to, or that you're going to be severely judged by the spirit can send you to hell or whatever. If there's not evidence for these things, it's not good to believe in them. I don't think that you motivate people. This is my personal view of the world. I don't think that you motivate people to live moral lives by fear and intimidation. That's just me. That's the way I feel. I think you do it by modeling good behavior and making people see the wisdom and the attractiveness of those kinds of lives. So I just say, stop that shit, man. Stop doing it.
Yeah. I'm with you. And, honestly, I kind of interpret differently when he says spirit that would protect you from hell. That to me is so carefully vague.
Yeah. Yes.
So my interpretation is what he's saying is like, if someone were like, what do you think he meant? I would say, I think he means there is a nameless higher power, energy that has no name, that he doesn't ascribe any religious name to, that protects him from living a life that would lead to his own personal suffering, which he could call hell. That's what I hear him saying when he says that, which is completely irreligious. It's just a kind of a spirituality that, again, is akin to someone like a William James at the psychology of religion and these sorts of things, kind of like spiritual experiences that you get kind of showing up in 12 steps and things of that nature. That's what I hear him saying. So just say that, dude. That's what I would just say that. And I don't, I do think it like messes with his credibility. And to your point, it misleads people. And so this leads to kind of how I want to wrap this up. I think a lot of times when we look at, I again, look all of this through my experiences with theology and religion, is I don't judge a doctrine based upon like if it's true according to scripture or whatever like that. That's what I was trained as a teenager to think. But as I grew, I began to understand like, no, like you study church history, none of us are holding the same doctrines as Martin Luther. Like none of us are holding the same doctrines as Thomas Aquinas or Augustine, or none of us are, because our environments are very different. So the question to me isn't, is the doctrine true? The question is, what does the doctrine create? How are the people who are attracted to this and holding this, what kind of people are there? And so I'm curious what your answer would be. What does his teaching and his thinking produce, the good and the bad?
One of my favorite, I'm going to answer this by a quick anecdote. One of my favorite polemicists and cultural critics is a lady named Laura Kipnis, who's written many books, and one of them is called Against Love. And what she does, which I think is so valuable, is to never really allow you to find like a landing spot. She's constantly poking holes in things. Even when you think she agrees with you, she's then going to poke holes in that. So she is this slippery eel, and she problematizes everything. And I think that's really healthy. We don't need that as a steady diet, but it's a really healthy thing. I think that sort of the doctrine of Jordan Peterson produces people who are more likely to look for the clear answer than continue asking the hard questions. And again, we need answers sometimes, but much more often than not, we need to continue to ask great questions. It's the Socratic method. It's the dialectical. It's thesis, antithesis, synthesis. The constant conversation that's going on in the culture that never ends. And I think that he is the example of somebody of like the convergent thinking. Is bringing everything to a head so that you have that answer that's ready. It's like I used to watch, I've mentioned John MacArthur. We know about John MacArthur. Maybe not everybody does it. He's a famous conservative preacher in Southern California. And you'll see videos of him like preaching in his church, and he'll say something. He'll make this easy, cheap point, and everyone's like, oh, yeah, I totally agree with you. Da, da, da. And it's just like, I don't want to be part of that. Like, where we're congratulating ourselves for not being part of a group or something. Like, I don't value the giving of solutions in pear-shaped tones to people that they can then run with. I like it when people leave a lecture or after reading a book scratching their head and saying, I really have to think more about this. And I think he's an advice guy. I think he's a guy who's got great intellectual prowess, who's reduced himself in a lot of instances to give us advice on this thing. And I think that culture needs more of the great questions.
Yep. And I notice just to piggyback on what you're saying there, the thing that makes him wise was his own personal process of asking questions and exploring and poking holes. And I think a wise teacher doesn't rob people of those experiences. It goes back to the ancient story. A rabbi is walking with his student, and the student says, "What's the meaning of life?" And the rabbi says, "Why would you trade such a beautiful question for an answer?"
Oh.
And what Jordan Peterson is doing, he's kind of like painted himself into a corner, whether he recognizes it or not. My guess is he has at some point. He seems like a very sincere and intelligent person, and but he's painted himself into a corner. Like, he is no longer doing the thing where he's encouraging people to ask questions and find out the answers for themselves. Like, the journey, a good therapist doesn't, you don't go into their office and then they just give you the answers, because you don't transform in that process. You just leave the same person wearing different clothes, and those clothes end up getting changed back. They snap back to whatever they were beforehand. There's no transformation. So what Jordan Peterson, being the answer guy, he's no longer inviting people into the process that, like, forces them through the painful, laborious work that he did to get where he's at. And so that would be kind of what I would hope to hear from these popular teachers. But the cynic in me, the skeptic in me, is just like, capitalism's too powerful. Like, it's too powerful. When you get a taste of what that can give you, it's really, really hard to let it go. That's my skeptical side.
I think chime in just a little tidbit here. Like, when I, as a concrete example, when he was in that YouTube short saying, if you don't have kids, you're deluded and immature. I mean, what if he, because he's so great with words, what if he could say something like, Trent, or anybody out there, you're in deciding not to have kids, what would be the greatest gain from that decision? And what would be the biggest thing you could miss out on? Mm-hmm. And boy, being asked it like that would really get me to think. It wouldn't make me defensive, because I've already tuned him out when he calls me deluded and immature. I'm already angry. But what if he asked it like that? Then I say, maybe I haven't really thought about it, and maybe there are things that I will have missed out on. And I got to think about that. That's a way of getting to a result that you want, but just in a different way.
Yeah. Our world of sound bites and brands does not support those kinds of people. And I think I get really sad that our culture doesn't have more celebrated wise people. We have celebrated experts, but that to me is not synonymous with wisdom. And I think with Jordan Peterson, it's hard to see someone that I actually agree so much with. But the areas where I disagree are really significant.
Yeah.
All right, let's go out on this, Trent. We've talked about this dude and kind of popularity. If you were Jordan Peterson, let's say you were his messenger, you were the marketing team, you're the chief guru of the marketing team, you were helping set up who he was doing the interviews with, and you were pitching him the final chapter for his opus book, whatever. What is the message that you would hope he would give as a way to help bring some resolution to all the content he's created in the past 5 years?
Well, do you mean what would be most advantageous for him financially? Or
no.
What would be the most salutary behavior?
What would you want to hear? If he said this, it would make me respect him infinitely more.
For him to say, hey, let me tell you the story of my journey of suffering and joy and intellectual investigation and interaction with human beings in a clinical setting in ways that people can't even imagine, that's allowed me to see this great mosaic of humanity. I'm still on that journey, and there are these things that I'm passionate about that I want to share with you, but I'm learning so many things, and I think the great adventure is truth-telling, and I'm inviting all of you into that, even as I'm growing in that. And part of what I'm learning is, just because you want to be a truth teller doesn't mean that you're going to have the corner on the market of truth. It might mean a lifetime of living with ambivalence and ambiguity, which he knows about quite well. It might mean living with ambivalence about a lot of things in a very uncomfortable way. But that way of going towards truth is incredible, and holding back on answers some of the time. I think with his popularity, if he invited people into that kind of pursuit of truth, that would have quite salutary effects.
Yeah, that's beautiful. For me, I just want to hear him say, guys, I don't believe in the God you believe in, but I do. I'm spiritual, not religious.
Spiritual? He could never bring himself to utter such a phrase. No.
Oh my God.
No, he would rather say phenomenologically significant than spiritual.
Yeah, there's not enough syllables in that. Well, everyone, thank you for joining us for our conversation about Mr. Jordan Peterson on Lead Balloons, the Alchemy of Unpopular Opinions. Trent, any final words?
I got nothing else, man. I think we covered quite a bit of ground, and I think it's a great conversation. Hope you all take something from it.
All right, peace, y'all.